Understanding the Vietnam War. This short video is meant to provide you with some context for the topics we will be talking about in the upcoming unit. Please be sure to understand this vocabulary before moving on to the video. Communist. A communist is someone who believes in the economic and social systems of communism. Communism is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Current communist countries include China, Laos, North Korea, Cuba, and Vietnam. Guerrilla warfare. Guerrilla warfare is when small groups use military tactics such as ambushes, sabotage, raids, and quiet movement to fight larger traditional militaries. Viet Cong. Viet Cong is a member of the Communist guerrilla movement, part of the Northern Vietnamese Army. Draft. The draft is a system for selecting young men for compulsory military service. Compulsory means they did not have a choice whether they wanted to go or not. People to know. Ngo Dinh Diem. Ngo Dinh Diem was the first president of southern Vietnam after French withdrawal in 1954. Diem was an anti-communist. Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was a Vietnamese communist revolutionary leader through World War II, French occupation, and the Vietnam War with the United States. John F. Kennedy. JFK was the youngest president of the U.S., and he led the U.S. through the Cuban Missile Crisis, set the goal of putting a man on the moon, founded the Peace Corps. He was the leader during the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement and the war in Vietnam. He was assassinated in 1963. Lyndon B. Johnson. Lyndon B. Johnson took office after the JFK assassination, passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and brought American troops into the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon. Nixon was president after Johnson, and during his presidency, the U.S. put a man on the moon, ended their involvement in the Vietnam War, signed a treaty with the Soviet Union, and opened relations with China. He resigned from office after the Watergate scandal. It is also important to understand the geography of Vietnam. On the left is a map of Vietnam during the war. As you can see, the country was split into North and South Vietnam. Northern Vietnam was supported by Communist China and led by Ho Chi Minh. The Viet Cong were a part of this northern army. South Vietnam was supported by the U.S. and led by Diem. The war spilled over into the bordering countries of Laos and Cambodia. Hanoi was the capital of northern Vietnam, and Saigon was the capital of southern Vietnam. As we can see on the current map of Vietnam, Hanoi is the capital of the reunited country, and Saigon has been renamed Ho Chi Minh City to honor the northern Vietnamese leader. One more important fact to note in order to understand this time period is that by the early 1950s, most of America owned a television. This was the first time the horrors of war were able to enter people's everyday lives.
They're the ones who have to win it or lose
We
it.
have declared war on ignorance.
From the protests in Chicago and Washington to the horror stories shared by those who experienced the war firsthand, there is much historical hype behind the Vietnam War. With United States caught up in hysteria against communism and having in the past fought for the freedom of the South Koreans against the northern advances of the Reds, America haphazardly walked into the situation in Vietnam. What it seemed they missed was the domineering history Vietnam had experienced for centuries. First from the Chinese, then the Mongols, and eventually French colonization and Japanese occupation. The 10-year-long job of digging strategic military tunnels through the jungles of Vietnam just to win their war is a testimony in itself of their motivation against foreign oppression. With such leaders as Ho Chi Minh, who gained his support from the common people, dressing, eating, and sleeping as they did, and military leaders who understood the chain of command and had no need for questions to be answered, there is little surprise concerning the fight they made against the U.S. It was their territory, their villages, their jungle, and their war. They weren't going to run away. And if they did, it was only to gain more support from local villagers or from the army in the north before reforming and attacking again. Because they were supplied by the Chinese Communists with military artillery and support, and also moved by the common people, they could transport heavy artillery through the jungles and up and down mountains with their large labor force to face the French and American soldiers as worthy opponents. U.S. involvement started long before the 1st Regiment of troops was sent to the eastern shores of Vietnam. As an ally with France, the U.S. supported French colonization of Vietnam against threats of communism, but French colonization in Vietnam came to a screeching stop at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, where Vietnam defeated the French, causing France to push out and seek peace agreements. At the Geneva Peace Accords in 1954, the Allies gained supportive control of South Vietnam, and the Communists gained supportive control of the North, dividing the country at the 17th parallel. This would stand till 1956, when the country would hold national elections, but the Allies did not fully support the Geneva Accord because of the predicted outcomes of the elections.
They have expended their manpower in reckless assaults, apparently designed to improve their bargaining position at Geneva. That is not a good prelude to Geneva.
The elections in the South led to No Dinh Diem, an anti-communist, coming into office amidst large amounts of controversies regarding the authenticity of the election. In 1957, Diem, with U.S. support, waged counterattacks against the North, claiming that they were trying to take the South by force. Diem's controversial election and foolish policies led many South Vietnamese, including university students, Buddhists, and other intellectuals, to join in supporting the Communists. Even though Diem arrested hundreds of individuals for suspected communist support, he claimed that the South was peaceful and that it was the North who was trying to take over the country. John F. Kennedy was not sure how legitimate Diem's rule was, and thus refused to get too involved in the war.
In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them. We can give them equipment. We can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists.
In 1961, Kennedy decided to assess the situation in Vietnam by sending a party to report on the conditions in South Vietnam. The results of this study were somewhat ignored by Kennedy, who decided once again not to get too involved, but instead sent support in machinery and military advisors. After Kennedy's assassination, Lyndon B. Johnson took the office. He decided, after a suspected attack by the Communists against U.S. ships off the coast of Vietnam, to wage war on Vietnam.
Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win. Why, oh why don't people concern themselves something with a country that's trying to maintain her independence from aggression, that's being invaded? Now, America wins the wars that she undertakes. Make no mistake about it.
Congress, with little apprehension, gave Johnson the ability to wage war without actually declaring war. This was only detested by two senators, Morse from Oregon and Gruning from Alaska.
Being in the minority never proves that you're wrong. In fact, history is going to record that Senator Gruning and I voted in the interest of the American people this morning when we voted against this resolution. And I'd have the American people remember what this resolution really is. It's a resolution which seeks to give the President of the United States the power to make war without a declaration of war.
Throughout 1964, Johnson considered what would be the best way to wage war in Vietnam. The Johnson Committee wanted the war to be precise, with little impact on the home front. This did not turn out to be the case. They soon realized that there were not enough volunteers, and a draft was instituted. As the draft continued and the deaths constantly came home, the infamous anti-war movement in the States began. Back in Vietnam, the Communists wished to break the United States to a point that they would be willing to go to the negotiation tables. Their attempt to destroy major southern cities was called the Tet Offensive. In 1968, Johnson claimed that he might go to the negotiation tables, but decided not to accept a renomination.
Let me tell you what those 4 years have done to America. The longest war that America's ever had in its history. The worst crime wave we've ever had in our history. The highest taxes we've ever had in our history. The highest rate in the cost of living that we've had in a generation. And the lowest respect for the United States of America in our history.
Nixon increased the air raids, started bringing troops home, and used the Vietnamese forces for ground support. The air attacks continued while possible peace agreements were being written. The Christmas bombings of northern Vietnam's major cities received international scorn. In 1973, the Paris Peace Agreement was signed, ending the hostility between the U.S. and North Vietnam. In April of 1975, the Communists advanced on the President's house in Saigon, taking final and ultimate control of Vietnam. Much blood was spilled, both by the Americans and Vietnamese, throughout the course of the war. Communism was being fought in Vietnam, but those who wished to see its end inevitably lost. Many American soldiers lost their lives, and the War Memorial in Washington is a testimony to this, moving the hearts of hundreds. The willing sacrifices of so many soldiers and the forced sacrifices of hundreds more will be forever remembered. A few thousand peasants with guns advanced against the French and Americans to come out victorious. But was it an advance of communism for them, or was it merely a fight for freedom? The Vietnamese had been oppressed for hundreds of years. This small nation showed the world that they would not go quietly into the night. They would fight, and they would succeed.